Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of the Capital Canvas Board with myself and Larry. Excited to be here. We started a series to talk about moonshot opportunities or opportunities that you consider futuristic. And we had a first episode talking about AI. We had another one talking about autonomous vehicle. And we did promise again to do one centered on energy. Because we just think energy is what sort of completes that conversation. And so here we are talking about energy. A lot of the conversation you're going to hear today is going to be, centered around stuff that is going on in the US. I mean, the US is the center of the world, so many of the things we'll talk about here would be recent, events in the US. But yeah, looking forward to the conversation. So, Larry, how you thinking about energy when you hear energy and AI? What comes to mind?
Constraints. I think that's the word that most of the tech entrepreneurs have started to use. Before we used to hear them talk about how they essentially cannot get their hands on enough NVIDIA chips, and that has become a constraint. But now I think that conversation is shifting to the constraint now being projected to be energy in the next couple of years. And I think maybe just to put it into context, the US current power demand, I think, is about 4,000 terawatt hour. And that is supposed to almost double by 2040 to, I think, 7,000 terawatt hours, right? So essentially growing by 3.5% on an annual basis. Now, there are many drivers to that growth. One of them is electrification. So how we're moving from internal combustion engine cars to electric vehicles, and even the onshoring of manufacturing, like we're seeing, Trump clamor for in recent times. But I think one that is probably the most important and maybe the biggest driver will be AI, artificial intelligence, and the build out of data centers. Now, the data centers that we have, if you put it into context, when you make a query to any of the LLMs like ChatGPT, for instance, the amount of energy required for one query is about 10 times what you use for something like a Google query. Like if you ask Google a question before, compared to you querying one of the LLMs right now, the amount of energy you need is like 10 times that. So what that means is there's going to be massive requirement for energy as some of these products scale, and then there's like wider adoption of all of these products, right? And I think there was one time, I think it was Sam Altman that said, just you saying thank you to your ChatGPT is costing them tens of millions of dollars.
You used to say thank. Oh my! I heard that, and I stopped saying thank you to my internal LLM at
Exactly.
work, and even ChatGPT and Google as well.
Yeah, because every time you prompt it, you're generating tokens and it's consuming energy.
Yeah.
So yeah, data centers have essentially now projected to account for, I think, nearly half of the growth in the US demand by 2030. I think right now it's at 200 terawatt hours, and it's projected. I think McKinsey is forecasting that to hit 600 terawatt hours by 2030. So essentially 3x in less than 5 years. So it is very evident that data centers and the build out of AI would contribute largely to the growth of energy and electricity demand. And then if you think about the data centers right now, apart from the capital costs that you use to install and kind of create that data center, if you're thinking about it from a operating cost perspective, energy costs represent about 40 to 70% of the total cost required to run that, right? So there's quite a need to increase the efficiency of all of those systems. Now, the question would then be, well, what exactly is the efficiency that they are seeking, right? Now, there are many ways to make the energy more efficient, or the models to be more energy efficient in terms of like inference or even training or research. But 3 ways that I think it's probably low-hanging fruits would be your chips design, the algorithm, and even how you prompt, right? Now, the chips, if you think about NVIDIA's Hopper that they did in like 2022, I think that one came out at 30 teraflops, right? And if you compare it to Blackwell, that I think it probably starts in 2025, I think that one was about 40. right? So it goes from 30 to 40 with the same level of power of 700 watts, right? So you can already tell that there's already an increase and a better efficiency from a chief's perspective. The same thing with algorithms. We're already seeing things like DeepSeek that is using the mixture of experts architecture such that you have sub-models so that you don't have to query the entire models with every prompt, right? So that would also drive efficiency. And then maybe the last one would be the prompting. I mean, there are many times where you ask a question, it gives you a response, you're not quite happy, you ask again, it gives you an updated question. So the number of times you keep doing that increases the amount of energy required. So if you had prompted it correctly the first time, you then reduce the amount of energy that you'd ultimately need, right? So I mean, there's just a lot of things that are impacting how the demand for electricity would change over time. And I mean, I don't know, there's quite, and then when you think about it from a perspective of US versus China, I think China is just way ahead in terms of how well they're doing in terms of generating electricity relative to the US. And if you think about this as a AI race, like who is gonna win this AI race between US and China, I think those are the two top countries. If it all comes down to energy, and if you remain with the current trajectory of how energy is being built out, then you can almost assume that China is going to win because the way that they're building out their own sources, and it's just way more advanced compared to the US. But the US again is not sitting on their hands. They're doing a lot of things, and I mean we'll get into it in a bit. But Trump and the current administration are taking a lot of steps to kind of bridge that energy gap such that they remain competitive relative to China. And you've already seen some of that from many tech entrepreneurs and politicians and how they're talking about we have to get this done in here, right? So I guess maybe on that basis, I think it is very clear that energy is now very important to everybody that is trying to build out this AI infrastructure. So maybe something to touch on would then be like, what are the sources of this energy and who are the players? And then maybe we can dive into some of the economics as well.
I think, yeah, when you were just speaking about how do you sort of were touching on trying to solve the problem. At some point, they're thinking about how do we solve the power constraints for AI. And you talked about the fact that one of the ways to do this could be at the chip level or data center level. And it just made me remember this stock that ripped this week. Navitas, I think is their name.
Yes.
The stock Navitas Semiconductor Corporation, NVTS. Larry reached out to me, I think it was on a Wednesday, and he showed me an aftermarket chart of this stock. 200%.
That's crazy.
And the next day, of course, it went up like 160%. I'm just at the points that we are recording this podcast now, in the last 5 days, this stock is up 112%. And they went up on the news that they had been selected by
NVIDIA
to partner for their next generation data center development. I mean, so in a age where we are expecting data centers to use gigawatts of electricity, you now need to rethink the entire stack. You can't just be thinking about generating more electricity. You need to now start asking yourself, how do you make your current stack more energy efficient? And let me just read a paragraph from the announcement from NVIDIA here. So they're saying modern AI data center requires gigawatts of power for the increasing demand of AI computation. NVIDIA's approach is to directly convert the 13.8 kilovolts AC grid power to 800 volts HVDC. I don't know what that means. At the power center perimeter. So basically, they are trying to optimize energy within the data center perimeter using solid state transformers and industrial grade rectifiers, eliminating several AC/DC and DC/DC conversion steps, which are some of the things that causes the high power demand. So this is going to significantly maximize efficiency and reliability. And so this is, this is some of the things that it just brings to life what you've just talked about when you're actually seeing this play out, almost instantly. But yeah, like as we're sort of discussing this episode, I looked into the power grid, the energy mix in the US, and it's really interesting what I observed. So basically, I mean, if you're thinking about energy, right? So you're thinking about energy production. So if you're looking at production, about 60 something percent, in fact, maybe even more of the energy that we still produce or that the US produces currently is still being produced by what I would call dirty energy rather than clean energy, right? So fossil fuel, coal, natural gas. And natural gas has really, really seen a boom in the last couple of years, thanks to LNG production that's skyrocketed in the US. And so it's almost made that sort of energy segment one of the best performing segments for the US. And if you think about the legacy investments that has gone into what these fossil fuels, it then becomes extremely difficult for new energy sources to compete on economies of scale, right? I mean, there are some natural laws that you can't beat, right? One of them is economies of scale. And it just turns out that because we've always relied on fossil fuel, there is massive proliferation of, what companies, plants that are just generating these sources, and it just makes that source, super cheap and affordable for everyone. Well, yeah, I'll say that in context because we're saying that it's super cheap. Well, I mean, people keep complaining energy is expensive. My wife just told me a few hours ago, our bill is not going down. So people are so conscious of the energy use, and this is even the cheap energy. Now, if you now think about how we solve the problem for the new energy demand that we are seeing, there are two ways to go. You can use the incumbent sources, which is the fossil fuel, but then you have to remember that there is the Paris Climate Accord, right? That the world got into and said, well, we need to eliminate fossil fuel because of carbon emissions. We need to now generate cleaner sources of fuel. And how do we do that? We need to basically think about solar. We need to think about wind. We need to think about hydropower. But then those sources are just super expensive. I mean, when we started having that conversation, it's just impossible for us to, for them to compete, on a, I don't know what the basic unit is, but maybe on a sort of very, very minute scale, they can't compete with, the fossil fuel. And so what had then happened was we now need to look for ways to subsidize, these new energy, sources. And yeah, there's just so many things in my head right now because then I'm now thinking it almost feels like you said, energy is now the bottleneck for the AI race. And it turns out that the US and China, they are not just competing on AI, they're also competing on energy. So the US accounts for the largest, they are the largest consumer of energy in the world. Sorry, they are the second largest, only behind China. China is the largest, for obvious reasons. Massive industrialization in China that happened required, massive, energy infrastructure. And so, if we think about the fact that the person who wins the energy race wins the AI race, it now makes the US super, super conscious and super, anxious about their energy generation. And so what had happened was, I mean, previous administration have now said, okay, we need to, now that we know that, so there are two constraints now. You have the overall energy constraints, right? But you now also have the self-imposed constraint of the Paris Climate Agreement, which means that you cannot use the incumbent energy sources, which is fossil fuel, and which is affordable and cheap. The US is the highest producer of natural gas and crude oil in the world. They can't just rely on that. They now need to create, new fuels. And so the energy mix have then shifted I would say in the last 10 years from, say, when you think about electricity as a whole, the share of renewables generation of electricity has moved from around 10% to 23% in the last year. In 2024, I think it was about 24% that was generated from renewables. So renewables meaning solar, wind, and hydro, as well as a little bit from geothermal turbines. So the mix has significantly changed from what we knew before. But then there's still that question of economics, right? The question never goes away. The only reason we were able to even achieve that change in mix in the first place was because there was massive subsidies that was given to solar, to wind. And those subsidies, I think they were in the tune of up to about between 250 billion and I think about 350 billion that was just pumped into that industry. And what that did was I created a surge in innovation that happened in that industry. And within the space of about 8 years, you saw a sort of reduction in the price of things like solar panels. I mean, the basic things that you would need to generate solar and wind energy, they reduced by almost a magnitude in the order of about 4. So about 4 times, so they were maybe 8 before, they had reduced to 2. And so that really spurred, that shift that you saw in that mix. Well, that is going to be something that you keep asking, how do we sort of sustain that going forward? With where we are seeing that we still will not be able to meet the demand for energy. When you think about what AI needs, what AI actually needs for that to continue to go. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes even when I think about it, it's almost as if the 2050 carbon net zero goals are going to take a backseat when it comes to AI and national security priorities. And I think that is already happening. Now, if it was a different administration, maybe that would be a different outcome. But right now, it's almost like the Trump's government, Trump's administration, Antonio Dutch, just first of all, he doesn't really care about renewables, and I mean, I'll touch on that in a bit. But the idea that if you had to choose between reaching carbon net zero or ensuring that the US stays at the forefront of build out and development of AI globally and not just within the US, then which are you going to pick? And I think from the current posturing and the actions that has been taken, it does look to me like what comes first is the national security. Just the way that they've kind of moved in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think the Energy Secretary in the US, Chris Reed, he released a secretarial order on February 5, and there were 9 sort of items on that order. And guess what the first one is? Advanced energy addition, not subtraction. So I think before we even get there, we need to think about the fact that, number one, Trump pulled out of the Paris climate agreement. And I think this secretarial order just sort of, solidifies how the US think about energy. So they're saying, whatever it takes, we're going to generate energy. We don't care about the sources. That's number one. Number two, we're going to unleash American energy innovation. Number three, we're going to return to regular order of LNG exports. Number four, we're going to promote affordability and consumer choices in home appliances. Number five, we're going to refill our strategic petroleum reserves. Number six, we're going to modernize America's nuclear stockpile. Number seven, we're going to unleash commercial nuclear plants in the US. Right? And on and on. Number eight, grid reliability and security. But I think this sort of order it shows us where America is going. And for me, that is number one. They are going 2 ways. Number one, generate energy at any cost. That's one. And from any sources. And number two, we're going nuclear. When I think about this order, that's what I see. 2 things: we generate energy regardless of the source. Forget about clean energy. Number two, we're going nuclear. And I mean, that sort of takes us into the next sort of stage of this conversation, right? So 90% of the new energy addition last year in the US was from renewables. So from solar, from wind. And so I have not seen anything around solar wind on this order. There's very little talk. I mean, we know what Trump thinks about wind. He's never really been a fan of wind turbines in the first place. But he's also never been a fan of nuclear. I think he said a few things about nuclear in the past, you know, and the general sentiment was he didn't really like nuclear. But I think solar and wind have suffered recently, which is now making people think about the future. What's the future looking like for energy, right? And that exactly what that talks about. You know, we want to unleash an era of energy innovation. And so what is the main thing with, if solar and wind accounted for what 90% of their new electricity you know, generation as new sources last year, why are we not sticking with solar and wind? It turns out that solar and wind significantly have challenges with reliability, right? So with solar, when the sun is not shining, you can't generate energy. And with wind, when the wind does not, you know, you don't have wind, you also can generate, you know, wind energy from the wind. Now, I think a few days this year so far, there's been days where you neither had the sun or the wind in specific areas. And so if your energy mix was significantly, you know, sort of tilted towards those two sources, that means that you would have no power, which is dangerous, right? And so there are two ways to solve that. The first way is to think about, I mean, there's been a massive offshoot of battery energy storage, right? Or BEPS. So many companies like Fluence have then, you know, created massive energy battery pack. Even Tesla as well, right? They're now creating these massive battery packs that would help protect the grid and also sort of, you know,
Tesla's
improve.
energy business is growing, I think, 100% in the last
Yeah,
2 years, and it's
yeah,
like run rate of about 10 billion now
yeah,
per
yeah.
year.
I wouldn't even be surprised. So I mean, this sector has really done well, right? But there's just that sentiment that this sector is really not. I mean, these segments of energy, or that mix of energy, solar and wind specifically, are not super reliable. They are not good for the grid. And so when you start thinking clean energy and you're thinking about something that is stable and reliable, that does not, you know, is not sort of whimsical, you're still thinking about nuclear. And I think that's where the US is now thinking, how do we make nuclear reliable? How do we sort of move over to nuclear? So nuclear is not new. I mean, if you think about the utility companies in the US, the regulated ones, significant, I would not say significant, but I mean up to 9% of their energy mix is from nuclear. So you've got these massive nuclear plants that you know, produce energy for these companies. The problem with nuclear is that, similar to solar and wind, number one, it's not gotten government subsidy yet. That's one. So it's super expensive, and it just cannot compete, you know, with fossil fuel. That's one. Just to context, to give you like an example, there's the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. It was shut down in 2019. It was previously operated by a company called Exelon, and the reason that they shut down was because they were not getting subsidy from the government, and they just couldn't. The economics of scale was not what's keeping the plant operational, so they shut the plant down. So cost. The second thing is nuclear is super complex. There's just so many things that have to work out all right for nuclear to, you know, to happen. And that complexity means nuclear is prone to some accidents. So there's been cases of meltdowns in multiple sites across the world. Two famous meltdowns in Japan that led to deaths, but also cases of improved tendency to improve exposure to, you know, carcinogenic you know, substances, the radiations. And so there's just that sentiment from people. People don't want to live near nuclear plants. I mean, if there was a nuclear plant close to my house, I wouldn't want to stay there. I would be looking to move away. And so that's the second thing, you know, that is really causing that headwind for that energy you know, segment to take off. The third thing is What? I think the third thing is for you to also operate nuclear plants, you need uranium, right? And uranium is not exactly the most it's not the most abundant resources, right? It's centered around different places in the world. And so at the end of the day, nuclear is not going to be an option for everyone. I mean, companies like the US and China, countries like that can raise their shoulder and say, yeah, we want this energy source. But I mean, the poorer countries would really not be able to, rely on this. So those are the sort of three things. And when you're thinking about sort of the future, how does it sort of change in the future? So people are now saying, well, it's very expensive to construct nuclear plants, but there are smaller ways, there are cheaper ways to actually go nuclear. And so there are companies that are now trialing out what we call the small modular reactors, SMRs. Couple of companies, I first got to know them because Larry introduced me to a company called Oklo. And man, Oklo, Oklo's return in the last year is 500%, over 500%. And there are three popular companies in this category. So you've got Oklo, you've got Nano
Nuclear,
Nuclear, you've also
and
got
NuScale, yeah.
NuScale, SMR. So those companies, companies are creating proof of concept for what would be SMR. So there's micro nuclear reactors, which is up to 10 gigawatts, and then you've got SMRs which can go up to, I don't know if it's 10, I don't know if it's gigawatt or megawatt.
Megawatt.
Yeah. You've got SMRs can go between 300 and 500 megawatts, and then obviously the bigger nuclear reactors can go up to about
1,000.
Yeah, above 1,000. And so these micro nuclear reactors and SMRs, this is where sort of people are looking at the future. It seems to be the part of energy that would then grow, as you can see, the return that you can generate from the firms that are moving in this direction as well. Yeah, so I think that's sort of like, if I'm thinking futuristically, what are the sources of energy that you would, you would look at? Obviously, these companies are really not doing anything special from what we know of how nuclear reactors operate. There is another technology or technique in trying to generate, electricity from nuclear that is called fusion. And I assume that if Oklo and the likes are growing at 500%, I think these folks might be growing at maybe 2,000%. The only problem is that they're not public. They are not public, and poor people like us cannot afford to invest. The big boys like Coastland, the billionaires are the ones who are sort of investing in this segment. So this is fusion. So this is when sort of two electrons are sort of coming together to create the boom and generate energy via nuclear fusion. But again, this is also we don't really know. I mean, in the past, there's been so many investments in this technology, and everything has gone to zero. And it's now back in fashion. Billions are then piling up into these new businesses. But we really don't know, like you said, we don't know if it's going to work. It's difficult to tell if these investments are going to yield anything. It's just funding innovation for now.
Speculative, yeah.
Yeah. If you're thinking about investing, it's still speculation. But I mean, from the point of view of the billionaires and and the government, they would tell you they are funding the innovation and they expect some return of some sort. But yeah, it's still super speculative at the minute. By the way, there is the other segment that we didn't talk about. What recently happened, right? Maybe we'll move into that. I don't know if you plan to cover that. If you're thinking about the investment trends in the last sort of couple of weeks, months, I think there's been recent headlines around, these energy segments, nuclear, solar, wind as well. I don't know if that's something you want to discuss, Larry.
Yeah, there's been a lot of changes in the last week, particularly, that has kind of shaken up nuclear and solar investments. But I think maybe to give a bit of kind of a bit of background so that people kind of understand what's going on. So I think in 2022 or 23, I think 22, the Biden administration passed what we call the Inflation Reduction Act, which essentially included some incentives for renewable energy generation. And one of the incentives was 30% on the cost of installing solar panels. You get it as ITC, the investment tax credit. It's an incentive, and the incentive was supposed to run until 2035. Now, that has been running. Companies have been benefiting from it, but then, and I mean, I think the thing that most people already know is that the Democratic Party kind of favors renewable energy, and then the Republicans historically have been more in favor of oil and gas. So now, with Trump winning the last US election, there's been some fears that some of the things that Biden has done will be undone. And I think we're already seeing some of that play out right now. So after Trump's victory, I think sometime in January 2025, he did declare a national emergency on the energy sector. And the goal really is to ensure reliability, diversifying, and creating affordable supply of energy, right? And then if you look at that declaration, if you look at the definition of energy in that declaration, he never mentioned solar and wind as an energy source, but then he mentioned uranium. Sometimes when I look back at this, I should have known that this guy was up to something.
Yeah.
Because he clearly left that out, and then he included uranium, right? So sometime last week, fast forward to last week, from all of that, a budget reconciliation bill was passed by the House and now forwarded to the Senate. And the bill essentially just terminated all of that 30% investment tax credit for solar effective December 2025, the end of this year. Essentially repealing all of the incentives that renewable energy generation we're getting in the IRA, right? Now, he then went on to sign or issue the Unleashing American Energy EO, that's the executive order, and that essentially now favors fossil fuels, nuclear, and also then reducing, support for solar, wind, and even I think there's now tariff on solar panel imported into the US, I think 20%. So essentially, build out of solar is now more expensive relative to what it was sometimes last year. And again, I think the problem now is that there are some build outs of that solar panel that is happening in some Republican-led states. So the hope is that when this bill gets to the Senate, it will be sent back to make some adjustments, and ultimately we'll know where that is going to land, right? Now, the market, as we know,
What do you think is going to happen?
I think they get some sort of middle ground with solar. I think there's going to be, like we said, all of these new ways of building out energy infrastructure, it takes a bit of time. If you think about the lead time for it to come online, come on stream, and then be able to actually deliver electricity to people that need it, or businesses and industries that need it. Nuclear, I think we're still 10, 15 years away from that being any meaningful source of minimum, exactly, for SMRs. There's some of them that are currently in operations, but for new SMRs, small modular reactors, I think we're like 10, 15 years away. And people like Elon has already said by sometime next year, we're already going to start seeing how electricity and energy would be a bottleneck for the build out of AI infrastructure. So I think, and then if you think about, okay, if you ask yourself, then what is what energy source is the fastest to build out? And then you find out you land back on solar, right? So I just think it's an abundant energy source that needs to be tapped, especially in the near term. I mean, you can continue your nuclear strategy in the longer term, but in the near term, there's a need to meet all of this energy demand, and I think solar is still going to play a huge role in that happening. So I think they work that back somehow. And I think another thing is this is at the federal level. I think at some point, like I mentioned, there are some states that are building this out where solar energy generation and just kind of favors them. So I think that we might get some state level incentives that will still help those businesses. But last week, the market has been touted as being very efficient and sometimes overly efficient. So last week, because of the news on the ending of the 30% tariffs and funding and other incentives for the solar projects and the renewable energy projects, the market sold off, right? So companies like SUUN that kind of delivers or helps to install solar panels for residential customers, I think it was down about 40%. First Solar that does that for residential was down, I think, maybe 5-6%, you know. And then you just had a whole lot more companies losing value. I think Enphase was down another 20% as well. And then on the other hand, the nuclear energy stocks, they skyrocketed. So you had NuScale, like we talked about, we had Oklo, we even had the uranium ETF and
CCJ.
exactly. And all of them just rallied ridiculously. We're talking 30%, 40%, 25% and things like that. So you can already tell where the market is kind of moving to. But I think, again, things like this, it's almost like a momentum trade. Because I don't know why an executive order is triggering this kind of reaction. Because first of all, there's no SMR anywhere in the world, right? It doesn't exist. Well, I mean, it exists on some people's PowerPoints presentation, but not in reality. So the idea that somebody's going to sign an executive order and then all of a sudden these stocks then become valuable. I mean, a portion of those investments have been de-risked by the signing of the EO. And I guess if you create a model based on expected value, then you might assign some value to that de-risking by government support. But these are still very highly risky projects that have not been proven, that are at best speculative investments at this point, in my mind. I mean, there's some people that are willing to commit risk capital to these things, and that's why civilization and society moves forward, because there's some people who are willing to put money to ventures like that.
Yep.
But I think from a capital allocation perspective, for myself personally, I see this as nothing more than a speculative investment. I can't see myself committing meaningful capital to this. It's all just fun and you see how it goes. Put some money in it, see how it goes, kind of thing. I mean, I've been in nuclear for a while, so I've kind of been in and out of it. For me, I see that as a trade at this point and not an investment. And I've been in and out of it. I've been in it a couple months, get out, get back in, kind of thing. So I mean, I just think that the nuclear, for one, is still very early stage and still very risky. But I think if someone is looking to make an investment in energy due to the build out of AI, say you want to diversify a bit from chips and you're looking for a new sector to kind of diversify into, and energy comes up, well, there are quite a number of ways to make this play. I think there are many sources. There's like nuclear, there's solar and storage, like you mentioned. There's wind, there's the utilities provider. I think utilities, when you look at the new build outs of the current data centers and where they're getting electricity from, I think about 70 to 80% of them are still getting it from the grid. I mean, new build outs are then building very close to where the data centers are and then delivering electricity directly. But the majority of those data centers are still getting electricity from the grid. So utility companies will still be quite important in getting those things done. And then also you can start to think about people who maybe generate or transport natural gas as well. So I think I've kind of, if we start from the top and just take those those 5 different sectors one after the other. I think nuclear we've already talked about. There are companies like Constellation Energy that are currently the largest nuclear operators in the US, and they already have PPAs with people like Microsoft. So we're not talking futuristic projects here. We're talking existing projects that are already operating. You have Vistra Corporation, which is like the second largest nuclear fleet. Very diversified business as well. I think they have some retail customers as well. So it's and I think they pay from dividends. So Vistra is someone I'll be looking at as well if I'm looking at investing long term in the energy market. Then if you then go to the more speculative small modular reactors, the SMRs, I think you mentioned NuScale, Oklo, nano nuclear, and things like that. Then solar storage, I think solar and then solar storage. We'll probably talk about FSLR. FSLR, I think, is the largest, is leading in the US in terms of commercial solar installations. And then I think they have like very huge backlog that would kind of prevent or at least augment any interim slowdown in solar build-outs just based off the regulatory uncertainties at the moment. We have Enphase, we have SolarBank, and even Tesla. Tesla, like I think I mentioned earlier, their current energy business is like $10 billion right now.
And
I know Tesla is
crazy scale.
100% growth rate in the last 2 years. I know Tesla is viewed by many people as just a car company, but it's proven for many reasons why it's not just a car company, and it's continuing to get into different businesses. With wind, you can look at NextEra Energy, you can look at Brookfield Renewables, utilities. There's Dominion Energy, there's SUUN Coal. Natural gas, we're talking maybe Kinder Morgan. I think that's the largest US gas pipeline network, right? And I think they pay dividend of about 5% on an annual basis. And then you have the number 1 US LNG exporter, Renewables Energy. So there are quite a number of ways to play this. I think for me, I would prioritize maybe utilities, solar, and natural gas. In terms of, say, if I had $1,000 that I wanted to deploy only to energy, that's where I would put the bulk of it in, and then a bit of nuclear. For SMRs, it would just hold a smaller portion, maybe 5 or 10% of that $1,000, because it's just for me, it's just speculative. It's a trade. It's not an investment. But I mean, if I were to say, you know what, actually, I want to create a fund for retirement, I don't mind leaving that fund. I'm never gonna touch it for 25 years. Then yeah, maybe you can commit some risk capital to that, and and then you just wake up in 25 years and you look at your accounts, and maybe nuclear is now mainstream source of electricity, and you just become a millionaire. But right now, I wouldn't see it as something I want to commit any serious capital to. I mean, the risks are just enormous in my mind. Because like I said, we don't even know when we're gonna get any working, right? Like, so yeah, that's how I would think about allocating capital to energy, especially because I think right now most people are probably overly exposed to AI.
Yeah.
And some of the businesses in AI are cyclical. And I know there's a lot of hype around AI and it's going to change the world. But sometimes if you look at the financials of some of these companies, they're quite up and down sometimes. So if anyone is looking to have some level of diversification, I think energy is a good space because there's a demand for it. It's almost defensive in itself, especially when you're talking of utilities. So the AI just provides an additional growth opportunity is the way that I'll think about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the future is bright. You have tech companies getting into deals with SMR providers and hoping to build out and support their AI build out. So interesting times for sure.
I like what you said about thinking about the space as I mean, so traditionally, people think about utilities as defensive stock, right? You think about regulated power providers, water providers. They've always been defensive stock. They tend to grow what anywhere from 2 to 6%.
Yep.
They tend to pay dividends, so people just especially pension providers they normally like these players, very
Because they pay
conservative.
dividend and
Yeah, you can model
yeah.
their demand. It's just so reliable and consistent. Um, and so even though we're seeing massive tailwinds from AI energy use, especially in the future, that is not just the main driver for increased need for energy. If you still sort of look at reports, you still see that there is more drive for new energy use from things like transportation. For
Yeah.
example, the advent,
Electrification of everything.
yeah, the advent of maybe self-driving cars and EV adoption will probably have a better flywheel effects than AI. If you think about the next 10 years on energy demand, consumer tech, smart cities, all of these would, create, increasing demand. So I like what you say there when you say it's not just AI. If you're looking to play the AI team and you're looking for the safer space, I think energy really, really looks like that kind of space. When I think about the space, by the way, and as you were speaking, I just really, really understood how exposed I am to this space, and it sort of scared me. Well, I think that's why last week I was sort of flat because I got very good sort of tailwinds from the nuclear um, blowouts. I think I keep telling you I like this sport because it spurs me to research, and when
Yeah.
I did that research, I invest on the basis of that research, and this time it really, really paid out. The cries from missing out on Pony and We Ride last in the last episode, the opposites this time around.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But for me, when I think about this space, right, and the opportunities, the way that I think about it is very similar to you. Where is the 10x opportunity, say, in the next 10 years? So that is a long-term futuristic opportunities. And for me, those are the SMRs, right? If eventually SMRs work, it's a moonshot investment, but you're
I
not
don't
going
even
to,
think it's 10x. I feel like it's maybe
yeah,
20 or
minimum.
like,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
10x is when you can't comprehend your return. You're like, yeah. So
If it
10x
works and
plus,
you're a very
yeah,
patient person
100x.
with high tolerance for risk. Yeah.
But guess what? And like you say, it's not even in the last 1 year. What? Which one of them? I think Nano is up 8x.
Yeah.
So 10x is not even
It's
10
not,
years,
that's why I
right?
was saying like,
10x
it
is
has not worked. It's already 8x.
it's already 8x, yeah. So I think
So, yeah.
100x next 10 years, if the concept actually is eventually proven out. So that's the first for me. That's if I had like a matrix in terms of return and timeline.
Yeah.
High, I would have on the top right, I would have things like SMR, NNE, Nano, and Oklo right there. And then when I think about medium, but still futuristic and innovative, I think about the people that are trying to stabilize the inner, or they are trying to solve the inadequacies of solar, right? So they are using innovation to solve the inadequacies of solar and wind. And who am I talking about? I'm talking about Tesla. I'm talking Bloom Energy. I'm talking Fluence. So this, aside Bloom, I think Bloom is a different category. But these are innovative companies that are trying to create sort of battery energy storage that are not
Storage.
just very short term. We are talking things that would actually save grids, not just residential alone. They would actually be able to use them in data centers. And Fluence and Tesla are already building out this sort of infrastructure in that category. So those would be for me. They are still sort of the innovative team, and the return is still very high. They are just under the SMRs. So over the next 5 years, you are going to see these stocks reap. I'll add Bloom Energy to that category. So Bloom Energy is doing something different, right? They are trying to prove electricity production via specialized fuels. So using a bit of natural gas, biogas, and hydrogen. And they're trying to create some new fuel category, and they are not just trying, they already have plans with in data centers. I think they've got a deal with Google or one of the big tech companies. They are doing this, but they need to then show that they can do this um sustainably and generate return and profits via this business. So I think that's another category. And then obviously you've got the near term. We already know that it can work, the solar and wind. And when I'm thinking about those ones, I'm thinking two categories. I'm thinking about so in fact, I'll actually, even this category, I'll separate them into two. I would say there is the futuristic part of solar. For example, I know that there are orbital solars, so people that are trying to create orbital farms, right, in space. And I know that First Solar is actually trying to do this, by the way. There are speculations that First Solar and some other large solar players are trying to do this. If they can actually do this, I think it's going to be a game changer. It's going to really, really reduce. It's going to be massive economies of scale, and it's just going to, the profits flywheel for those companies is just going to accelerate. And so I think in that category, which is why when you look at First Solar, it doesn't really, that stock doesn't move as much as the other solar players. It's just very different because they are doing
It's less volatile, yeah.
Yeah, it's less volatile. They're doing what they are doing at scale. So I'll put them in a separate category, right? Just because of the innovation and how massive and scalable and lucrative their brand is as well. And then you've got the other solar player like Enphase, like SUUN, and all the rest. I think those will be in the lower parts. I don't expect massive return, but I will still bet on them. And then for the utility players, who there are two categories. I'll separate them into the incumbents who have very decent mix, like Nexextra, like Dominion, like who else? You've got Duke, you've got Valero, you've got Talent. Many of these companies like Talent have contracts already, like Vistra, Talent, and I don't know the last Vistra, Talent, and one other player. Those are independents, right? So they've got contracts with big tech. And if you look at those companies, NRG is the last of the three of them. So Vistra, Talent, and NRG, those companies have grown in excess of, on the average, 20% year to date. And over the last year, on the average, they probably have grown over 50%. That is almost 5 times what the S&P has done. And that's because these companies are more nimble. They are adding massive generation opportunities to their grid-through deals. And so there's so much room and potential for these companies. They look expensive, but like you say, when you see stock that look expensive from a PE basis, you need to actually think about what opportunities the future holds for these companies. And so those ones are also very different. They are on the tail end, but they are one step away from the general utility sector, which I would just class as the Nexextra, the Dominion, and all the other, some of the other ones that you've shared. So that's the way that I think about this sector. And I think it makes sense to have exposure across all these classes. And if you can't, maybe just buy the ETFs. I think the ETFs are going to do well over the next 5 years, just given what we've said about how energy demand is going to play out. Well, yeah, that's my take on investing opportunities for the sector.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, ETFs are key as well. Because sometimes the individual price of these stocks are just really high. So sometimes it's difficult. If you have limited cash, for instance, it's difficult to get exposure to it. So I think, for instance, if you say, oh, I have $1,000, I want to invest in AI, and then somebody says, oh, buy ServiceNow and others. Well, ServiceNow is already over $1,000, so there's nothing else to buy. So in those kind of cases, you're better off buying, an index that is maybe cheaper, hopefully. Yeah. So no, index amazing, especially when you don't want to think too much, you don't want to manage your portfolio. Just go for an index.
Yep. Cool.